Hey everyone, ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Today we're tackling something you might not be familiar with. Human metapneumovirus,
Or HMPV for short.
HMPV for short.
Yeah.
Now you might be thinking, ugh, another virus. But this one's got a really interesting backstory.
It does.
It wasn't discovered until 2001.
Yeah.
Kind of makes you wonder, how could something so common stay hidden for so long?
Right. It's fascinating how something so prevalent could go undetected for so long. It really speaks to how much we're still learning about viruses.
Yeah, really highlights the mysteries still out there in the world of, you know, tiny things, I guess.
Definitely. The world of microbiology is full of surprises.
It is. It is. So let's get right into it. What exactly is HMPV?
Well, HMPV is respiratory virus, and it's actually a close relative of RSV, which you might be more familiar with.
Oh,
Like RSV, HMPV is found all over the world.
okay.
And it can cause a whole range of respiratory illnesses, from mild cold-like symptoms to, the more serious stuff like pneumonia.
Okay, so common can be anything from mild to serious. Definitely got my attention.
Yeah.
But before we get into the nitty-gritty of the symptoms and all that, I am curious, if it's so common, why did it take us so long to discover it?
That's a great question. And for a long time, I think HMPV infections were probably just lumped in with all those other respiratory illnesses.
Hmm.
It wasn't until, scientists developed those more advanced techniques for identifying viruses that they were able to isolate and really characterize HMPV as its own distinct
Yeah,
virus.
so it's hiding in plain sight, basically.
Exactly, yeah. And the fact that it took until 2001 to really pinpoint it, I think that just underscores how much we still don't know about all these tiny but powerful pathogens.
Yeah, definitely humbling when you think about it. It makes you realize how much we still have to learn, I guess.
For sure.
So, back to HMPV. We know it can be serious, so who should be, like, extra careful about this virus?
Well, there are definitely certain groups that need to be more vigilant. So we're talking young children under 5. They're particularly susceptible to those more severe HMPV infections,
Right.
as are older adults over 65.
Makes sense.
And of course, anyone with a compromised immune system.
Right.
So, for example, folks undergoing cancer treatment or organ transplant recipients.
Okay, so little ones, older folks, immune compromised.
Exactly.
Got it. You mentioned it's found globally, but we've been hearing some reports about HMPV outbreaks in China, right?
Yes, that's right. China has been seeing these outbreaks mostly affecting children under 14.
Wow.
It's a good reminder, I think, that even though we may not be hearing about it every day on the news and stuff, HMPV is a global issue, and it's something we should all be aware of.
Okay, awareness is key.
Yeah.
And speaking of things to be aware of, let's talk symptoms. If I think, oh, maybe I have HMPV, what should I be looking out for?
Well, the good news is that for most people, HMPV feels like a mild, cold-like illness. So think, runny nose, sore throat, cough, maybe a low-grade fever, the kind of thing you've probably dealt with countless times before.
So how do I know then if it's just a cold or if it's actually HMPV?
That's the tricky part. Clinically, it can be really tough to tell them apart just based on symptoms.
Hmm.
And, while most people will kind of sail through an HMPV infection with no problems, we've got to remember that those vulnerable groups that we were talking about, they can experience much more severe symptoms. So that could be high fever, wheezing, difficulty breathing, things that would definitely land you in the doctor's office.
Yeah, okay. So while a runny nose might not be a big deal for most of us, it sounds like it's a whole different story for folks who are, more vulnerable.
Exactly. It's really important to be aware of those more severe symptoms, especially if you're caring for, a young child or an older adult.
Okay, noted. So let's talk specifically about kids for a sec. Are there any, particular symptoms that parents should be on the lookout for?
Yeah, children, especially the younger ones, they're more likely to develop lower respiratory tract infections from HMPV, and specifically something called bronchiolitis.
Hmm. Bronchiolitis. Okay, full disclosure, I'm not really sure what that is.
So bronchiolitis is basically an inflammation of those small airways in the lungs, those tiny bronchial tubes.
Okay.
And when those airways get inflamed, it makes it really hard for kids to breathe.
Ah, okay. That does sound scary.
It can be, yeah. If you see your child struggling to breathe, has a high fever, or if their symptoms are just getting worse, it's really important to get them medical attention right away.
Absolutely, definitely. Okay, so we've established this virus is kind of sneaky and it can be more serious than it initially seems.
Yeah.
How does HMPV actually spread? Is it like the common cold where you can, catch it from basically anything?
It's very similar to other respiratory viruses in how it spreads. So coughing, sneezing, contact with those contaminated surfaces, those tiny little droplets that fly out when someone coughs or
Yeah,
sneezes,
right.
those droplets can land on surfaces, and if you touch those surfaces, boom, you pick up the virus.
Just like the common cold then, pretty much.
Yeah, pretty much. But here's something that might surprise you. HMPV can actually survive on surfaces for several hours,
Mm.
which obviously increases the chances of transmission.
Okay, so good hand hygiene is a must. But how do you even know if you have HMPV? Is there a test for it?
There are tests, yes, but diagnosing it usually starts with a visit to the doctor. They'll, do a physical exam, listen to your lungs, ask you about your symptoms, if you've been around anyone else who's been sick, all that.
So pretty standard procedure. But what about actually, confirming it's HMPV?
Right. To confirm the diagnosis, your doctor would probably order some lab tests. There are a few different types. Two of the most common are RT-PCR and ELISA.
RT-PCR and ELISA. Honestly, those sound like something out of a science fiction movie.
They do sound pretty technical, I know.
Yeah.
So RT-PCR, that stands for reverse transcription polymerase chain reaction. It's basically looking for the virus's RNA in a sample. So it's searching for its genetic fingerprint.
Mhm.
ELISA, on the other hand, that stands for enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay.
Gotcha.
And it's used to detect antibodies or viral antigens. And antigens are those substances that trigger an immune response.
Got it. So one looks for the actual virus, and the other looks for signs that your body's fighting it off.
Exactly. And then in more severe cases, particularly if someone has to be hospitalized, the doctor might do a bronchoscopy.
Bronchoscopy. Oh, that sounds a little intense.
Not a routine procedure, that's for sure.
Right.
It involves, inserting a thin tube with a camera into the lungs to get a fluid sample.
Oh, wow.
Helps doctors get a better understanding of what's happening in there.
Okay, so you've got the diagnosis. What happens next? Is there a cure for HMPV?
Unfortunately, there isn't a specific antiviral medication for HMPV yet.
Oh, okay.
The good news is that most cases are mild, and they resolve on their own with rest and just supportive care like you would with a cold.
So lots of fluids, chicken soup, that kind of thing.
Pretty much. Over-the-counter meds can help with fever and aches and congestion.
Okay.
For those severe cases, especially in people at higher risk, doctors might prescribe inhalers or oral steroids to help with breathing, reduce that inflammation, but it depends on the individual situation.
Makes sense. No magic cure, but we can at least manage the symptoms.
Right.
What about preventing HMPV in the first place? Any tips for staying healthy?
Well, the good news is a lot of the strategies for preventing HMPV are the same things we should all be doing to protect ourselves from other respiratory viruses. It boils down to good hygiene.
Okay, let's talk hygiene. What are the must-dos?
Frequent hand washing is at the top of the list, and I mean really washing, not just a quick rinse. Use soap and water, scrub for at least 20 seconds, make sure you're getting under your nails and between your fingers.
Yeah, okay. I'm definitely guilty of the quick rinse sometimes. I'll have to up my hand washing game.
Yeah. When soap and water aren't available, hand sanitizer is your best friend.
Okay, noted. What else?
Avoiding close contact with people who are sick is key. You hear someone hacking and coughing, maybe give them a little extra space.
Right.
And if you're the one feeling under the weather, stay home. Rest up. Don't spread those germs.
Yeah, makes total sense. What about cleaning surfaces? Is that important for HMPV?
Absolutely. Remember, HMPV can linger on surfaces, so regularly wiping down frequently touched areas like doorknobs, countertops, light switches, anything you touch a lot with disinfectant, that can go a long way.
Okay, so it's all those common sense things we've been hearing about forever.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder why we don't do them more often, huh?
Right. It's easy to get complacent, but it's important to remember these simple habits really can make a big difference.
They really can. Now, I know there's no vaccine specifically for HMPV yet, but are there any other vaccines that might help, that might offer some kind of protection?
While there's no HMPV vaccine yet, staying up to date on other respiratory vaccines, like the flu shot, can definitely help reduce your overall risk of getting sick. It's all about keeping that immune system strong and ready to fight.
Okay, good hygiene, vaccinations, got it. But say I do end up catching HMPV, how long does this thing usually stick around?
In most cases, those with mild symptoms, they can expect to be feeling back to normal within 7 to 10 days. Some people might feel a bit dragged out for up to 2 weeks. But for those high-risk folks we talked about, remember, it can be a different story.
Right, right.
Severe cases can last longer, and, sometimes they require a hospital stay.
Definitely a good reminder that it can be more serious for some than others. At what point should someone with HMPV see a doctor?
It's always a good idea to check with your doctor if you have any concerns, especially, if you have an underlying health condition and you develop a respiratory infection.
Right.
And just pay attention to how you're feeling. If your symptoms don't get better after a few days, or if you have a fever that hangs around longer than 3 days, definitely give your doctor a call.
So if it's dragging on or getting worse, time to seek professional help. Are there any, red flags, any symptoms that would warrant immediate medical attention?
Absolutely. If you have a high fever over 103 degrees Fahrenheit, if you're having trouble breathing, if you notice a bluish tinge to your skin, lips, or nails, or if any existing health conditions start to worsen, don't wait. Seek medical attention right away.
Okay, important to know. Now, I know we've been focusing on how common HMPV is, how most cases are mild, but we've also touched on the potential for complications. Can we dive into those a bit more?
Of course. While most people recover from HMPV without any lasting issues, complications can arise, and this is particularly true for, those vulnerable groups we've talked about.
Right.
As we mentioned earlier, bronchiolitis and pneumonia, those are two of the most common complications, especially in young children and older adults.
We talked about how scary bronchiolitis can be, but I'm not as clear on pneumonia. What's the big concern there?
So pneumonia is an infection of the lungs, and it can be caused by a bunch of different germs, including HMPV.
Okay.
And it can be tricky because often it starts with those flu-like symptoms, but then it just takes a turn for the worse. Essentially, the air sacs in your lungs, they fill up with fluid, which makes it really hard to breathe.
Yeah, that sounds really serious.
It can be, especially for people with weakened immune systems or other underlying health conditions. And pneumonia, unfortunately, isn't the only complication HMPV can cause. So in some cases, HMPV can actually lead to something called acute respiratory distress syndrome.
ARDS. Okay, that sounds pretty intense. What is that exactly?
It's a life-threatening condition where fluid builds up in the lungs, making it super difficult to breathe. It's like your lungs are drowning, essentially.
Oh, wow. That sounds really serious. So we've got bronchiolitis, pneumonia, ARDS, all pretty scary stuff.
Yeah.
Anything else we should be aware of?
Yeah, we also need to think about the impact HMPV can have on pre-existing conditions. So someone with asthma, for example, or COPD, an HMPV infection could really make their symptoms much worse.
Oh,
Trigger a flare-up.
So it's not just about the immediate infection, it's about the potential long-term effects as well.
Exactly. And there's one more thing we need to consider. Secondary bacterial infections.
Secondary bacterial infections, what does that mean?
Well, sometimes when your body's busy fighting off a virus like HMPD, it can become more vulnerable to other infections, especially bacterial ones.
Okay.
So you might start with HMPV, but then develop a bacterial pneumonia on top of it.
So it's like a 1-2 punch.
Exactly, yeah. Your immune system's already working overtime, and then it gets hit with another attack.
This is a lot to take in. It sounds like HMPV is definitely more than just a simple cold.
You're right, it is. It's a virus that deserves our attention, especially considering how common it is.
I agree. So to recap, we've got this virus, relatively new to science, incredibly common. It can range from, mild to severe, and has the potential for some pretty serious complications. What does this all mean for us? Where do we go from here?
That's the big question, isn't it? I think it highlights how important it is to stay informed and be proactive about our health.
Yeah.
We need to be aware of the viruses that are circulating in our communities, understand the risks, and take steps to protect ourselves and those around us.
It's that whole knowledge is power thing, right?
Absolutely. The more we understand about these viruses like HMPV, the better equipped we are to make those good decisions about our health.
For sure. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, but before we wrap up, I wanted to go back to something we talked about earlier, the fact that HMPV wasn't discovered until 2001. It's kind of mind-blowing that a virus this common could go undetected for so long.
I know, it's amazing, isn't it? And it makes you wonder what else might be out there.
Right.
Lurking in the shadows, waiting to be discovered.
It's fascinating and a little bit unnerving. To be honest, it's like we're just scratching the surface of this whole world of viruses.
Exactly. And as our world becomes increasingly interconnected, it's more important than ever to be vigilant about these emerging infectious diseases.
You're absolutely right. We need to be prepared not just for the viruses we know about, but for those we haven't even encountered yet.
And that preparedness,
Yeah.
it involves, those things like good hygiene, vaccination, but also fostering a global culture of collaboration and information sharing, particularly in the scientific community.
Yeah.
We need to be able to quickly identify and respond to new threats as they pop up.
I couldn't agree more. We're all in this together when it comes to fighting viruses.
Absolutely. Viruses don't respect borders, and neither should our knowledge or resources.
That's a great point. So on a more practical level, what can our listeners do to stay healthy, to protect themselves from HMPV?
Well, we've talked about it a lot already, but good hygiene is really paramount. So frequent and thorough hand washing, using hand sanitizer, covering those coughs and sneezes, avoiding close contact with anyone who is sick, those are all simple but very effective ways to lower your risk of infection.
Okay, so those are the basics. But what about those more vulnerable groups we talked about, like young children, older adults, people with weakened immune systems? What extra steps can they take?
For those individuals, staying up to date on their vaccinations, including the flu shot, that's super important. It may not protect against HMPV specifically, but it can help lower their overall risk of respiratory infections.
Okay.
And particularly during cold and flu season, it's a good idea to limit exposure to large crowds, especially in enclosed spaces.
So maybe skip those big holiday gatherings if you're not feeling great.
Exactly. It's about being mindful and taking those precautions when you need to. And of course, if you're caring for someone who's at higher risk, those good hygiene measures we talked about become even more important.
Makes sense. What about masks? Are those still recommended?
Masks can be helpful, especially in those crowded or poorly ventilated settings. Or if you're in close contact with someone who's sick,
Right.
they provide an extra layer of protection, both for yourself and for those around you.
Okay, so if you're feeling a little sniffly, popping on a mask is a good way to show you care. What if you start experiencing those HMPV symptoms? What's the best course of action?
First thing is to stay home and rest. This will help your body fight off the virus and prevent you from spreading it to others.
Okay.
Drink plenty of fluids, consider those over-the-counter medications for symptom relief. And most importantly, if your symptoms are severe or concerning, don't hesitate to reach out to your healthcare provider.
Excellent advice. So a combination of good hygiene, common sense precautions, and staying informed, that's our best defense against this tricky virus.
I think so, yeah. And remember, knowledge is power, right? The more we understand about viruses like HMPV, the better we are at protecting ourselves and our communities.
I couldn't agree more. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. But before we wrap things up, I wanted to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question. Knowing that HMPV is relatively new to science and that viruses are constantly evolving, what does that tell us about this ongoing battle against infectious diseases?
That's a great question. And I think it highlights the fact that this is a battle that never really ends. We're constantly learning, adapting, and developing new strategies to try and stay ahead of these microscopic foes.
It's almost like an ongoing arms race, isn't it?
In a way, yes, but it's also a testament to human ingenuity, our determination to safeguard our health and well-being. And while there's still so much to learn about HMPV, I think there's also reason for optimism.
Optimism is good, especially when we're talking about, viruses. Earlier, we mentioned there's no vaccine for HMPV just yet, but I know scientists are working on it. What are some of the promising approaches they're exploring?
Well, one approach that's looking really promising is actually based on a similar strategy to that RSV vaccine, which was recently approved for infants.
Okay.
And this involves using a protein from the virus itself to kind of trigger that immune response.
So you're exposing the body to like a harmless piece of the virus, so it learns to recognize it and fight it off if it encounters the real thing later on.
Exactly, yeah. It's like giving your immune system a sneak peek at the enemy so it can be ready for battle.
I like that. Are there any other strategies in the works?
Definitely. Researchers are also looking into antiviral medications that could target HMPV directly. And these would work by basically disrupting the virus's ability to replicate and spread in the body.
So kind of like how antibiotics work against bacteria, but for viruses.
Exactly. We already use antiviral medications to treat other viral infections like the flu and HIV, so there's a lot of hope that we can develop effective antivirals for HMPV as well.
That's really interesting. It's amazing to think about all the work that's going on behind the scenes to, combat these tiny but powerful threats. It sounds like there's a lot of reason to be hopeful about the future of HMPV prevention and treatment.
I think so too. And while it's important to be aware of the risks associated with HMPV, It's also important to remember that science is constantly advancing. We're learning more about this virus all the time and developing new tools to fight it.
That's what I love about doing these deep dives. We get to explore these really complex topics, learn from the experts, and ultimately kind of empower ourselves with knowledge.
Absolutely. Knowledge really is the best defense we have. And with that knowledge, comes the ability to make those informed choices about our health and the health of our loved ones.
Well said. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, from the basics of what HMPV is to, the latest on vaccines and treatments. We've explored this virus from every angle.
We have from the symptoms, how it spreads, those potential complications, and, most importantly, the things we can do to protect ourselves and our families.
Yeah, I think our listeners are leaving today well-equipped to navigate the world of HMPV.
I hope so. And remember, the journey of discovery doesn't end here. There's always more to learn, more to explore, and more to share.
I love that. So to all of you out there, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay healthy.
And until next time, keep on diving deep.